Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this event, this SQA Connections event on HN grading and standardization in NextGen. My name's Andrew Newman. I'm one of the research and policy managers here at SQA, and I've been working closely with the NextGen team over the past year and a half on grading and standardization in NextGen. And I want to use this session to share quite a bit of detail. So I've got quite a few slides to go through. Obviously, the event's being recorded for reflection after the day if we need it. Quite a few slides to go through. So I'm going to go through those slides. I'll take a brief break in the middle for a short video and see if we have any questions at that point. Otherwise, I'll carry on until the end and try and make sure we leave a little bit of time for any questions at the end. So if you do have questions as we go through the slides, it would be great to pop them into the chat and I will return to those when we get to the end of the session. So today I just want to cover three things. Firstly, where we're at with the piloting and evaluation of NextGen grading and standardization, how grading works in the NextGen qualifications, and why we think standardization of those grades is important. So I'm going to start with the piloting and evaluation of NextGen grading. So these qualifications are built around a new set of design principles, and I've put them up on screen there kind of as a reminder. They'll be familiar to anyone who's had any involvement with the NextGen. If you haven't, they reflect an intention to update and refresh these qualifications in a number of different ways. I'm not going to try and cover all of those today, but I do just want to note that they include, in the new versions of the qualification, incorporation of content on learning for sustainability and content on meta skills, which I'll return to later on in the session, and also new grading models. So moving away from the graded unit that we have in the current qualifications and moving to a whole qualification grading approach with a new set of grade outcomes achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction. Obviously, these are significant changes to the qualifications, and SQA has taken a service design-led approach. What we mean by that is that prototypes of the new qualifications have been developed and then they have been tested during actual delivery. So this is real piloting with real learners delivering the qualification, well, real learners on the qualifications, real centres delivering the qualifications. And that's allowed us to have a really thorough evaluation of how successfully those new design principles have been implemented, to really understand how they're working, where they might need additional guidance and so on and so forth, and to kind of test and prove that, that they're fit for purpose and that we've got them right. So that's been a fairly extensive project. And if I bring up the next slide, you'll see where we are in terms of that piloting and delivery. This is a list of the qualifications, the new versions of the qualifications that we have piloted with centres over the past couple of sessions. So for the most part in sessions 22-23 and sessions 23-24. Obviously, we've just come to the end of session 23-24 and we're starting session 24-25. And what you can see from this slide is that we've completed almost all of the new qualifications in terms of at least 1 year's delivery. And that means we've been able to do really thorough evaluation of the delivery of these qualifications. And we've been talking about piloting these qualifications for quite a long time, but we genuinely are coming to the end of the evaluation stage of that approach. And we now have a really good and thorough understanding of how the grading approach should work for these qualifications in the future. That has mainly taken place through centre engagement. I bring this one out as one of many strands of evaluation that we've gone through because it's particularly relevant to how the qualifications have been delivered. But the centre engagement has been absolutely vital. We have talked to all of our pilot centres who've delivered these qualifications in a lot of detail about how the delivery of those qualifications has gone. In respect of grading, what we've done is had grading reviews where we have reviewed in detail how they've gone through the approach of applying the new grading approach for these qualifications. Those reviews have consisted of centres coming in, usually face-to-face, sometimes via Teams, sharing some of the assessments that they have delivered to their learners, talking us through how they've made grading judgments in detail, and sharing that experience with us, being able to, ask them questions about how that's gone. Now, we've usually done that in groups, 2 to 3 pilot centres per qualification. So they've also been able to share, each other's experience in terms of how they've delivered those qualifications. And I think that's been a very thorough and successful approach to evaluating the way the qualifications are working in terms of their grading. It's really shown the advantages of one of the sort of principles of that service design-led model, which is that we co-develop these qualifications with the people who will actually be delivering them, i.e. the centres. It's been a highly qualitative approach to the sort of research and evaluation around the delivery of these qualifications, and I think that's appropriate given the complexity and the nature of the qualifications themselves. And we've shared some information on that in an example grading review on the SQA website. Links will be in the chat at the end of this meeting, and there will be a forthcoming blog just sharing some of our sort of own experiences going through that approach if you want to read more about that engagement. But I think the key point for me is that engagement has been really rich and thorough, and it's put a lot of confidence around the grading approach for these new qualifications, and that largely we've got it right. And I think that's really important when you're embedding a new version of grading in new qualifications. So I'll come on now to talk about what the grading approach actually is. So we now have one model for grading on these NextGen qualifications, supported by an underpinning set of design principles. And what this means is any NextGen HNC or HND qualification will have a common set of characteristics which can be well understood and delivered in a reliable way across a whole range of different subject areas. That model is designed to allow a really high degree of flexibility in terms of assessment. So centres will have a lot of opportunity to produce and write their own assessment in a way that suits them, suits their delivery model, suits perhaps their local context, whilst obviously at the same time assessing the units within the qualification. But the grading model also means that all centres, regardless of where they are delivering, will have a holistic approach to the grading judgment that is made against a consistent set of criteria and can be standardized nationally, because obviously it's really important that regardless of where a learner goes to do their particular NextGen HN qualification, they're judged against the same national standard. And as I say, this model's been tested and proven through the piloting that we have done. Now, each NextGen HN qualifications has units. Those units have evidence requirements, and those evidence requirements must be achieved in a kind of pass-fail, achieved or not achieved sense. And that's the same as the current qualifications. So that gives a really robust underpinning to the delivery of these qualifications and really gives confidence that anyone who isn't achieved on these qualifications is achieved across the breadth of content. Whole qualification grading is about judging whether a learner is achieved with merit or achieved with distinction, or just an achieved. That's not to say an achieved grade isn't a meaningful and valuable grade in and of itself, but whole qualification grading is judging whether a learner is just achieved or achieved with merit and achieved with distinction. And the grading matrix approach that we've come up with for the grading model will allow centres to make those judgments across whatever range of assessments they've produced to assess the content. It'll also allow our EQAs to check those judgments and for standardisation to happen. Now, I mentioned that this was underpinned by a set of design principles, and I'll briefly go through these design principles. These are the core principles that all NextGen HN qualifications will have in going forward in future. They'll all be validated against these principles. So anything that has the NextGen HN badge will meet these principles. NextGen HN qualifications will have whole qualification grading. So they will be graded based on a learner's attainment from across the course content. NextGen HN qualifications will be graded either achieved with merit, or achieved with distinction. And there will be common qualification grade descriptors included in the documentation for the qualification. A learner's grade will be determined by the application of criteria in a grading matrix. or equivalent, which will be developed by a subject team. And finally, a learner's engagement in the planning, development and reflection on their meta skills will contribute towards their final grade, with a common meta skills grade descriptors included in the qualification documentation. Now, I suppose those first three are probably fairly familiar to anyone who's taken a glancing look at the NextGen approach. I would say that the difference with meta skills is it's a genuine addition to the qualifications, and I'll return to talk about meta skills and learning for sustainability later on in this presentation. In the meantime, what we wanted to do was share a short video that we've prepared, which we think is a good introduction to the design principles that underpin these qualifications. Now, I'm hoping that I've got my screen sharing right, and you'll be able to hear this. So I'll keep an eye on the chat, and Pamela or Jordan will shout at me if I've got this wrong. But this video is only 3 minutes long, so don't worry, it's not too long. And I'm hoping this will give you a good sense of the design principles, and is really a useful intro if there's anyone else you know who might be interested in NextGen grading and want to know a little bit more about the underpinning principles. So I'll pause there and share this video.
We recently finished evaluating the grading for NextGen HN qualifications. We have a well-defined approach with clear design principles and guidance which will remain consistent across all NextGen HN qualifications. We will now give you a brief explanation of the key design principles that all NextGen HN qualifications will meet with respect to grading. Design Principle 1. The qualifications will have whole qualification grading, which means a learner's final grade will be determined by their achievement across the qualification content. The evaluation activity we have carried out has shown that learners are more engaged throughout their qualification when this grading approach is applied. Design Principle 2. The learner will receive a grade of achieved, achieved with merit, or achieved with distinction. Our new grade outcomes are different from previous outcomes, and it shouldn't be assumed that they are equivalent. For example, a grade of C is not necessarily equivalent to a grade of achieved, because the grading approach has changed. Design Principle 3. The learner's grade will be based on a grading matrix which has a set of holistic criteria that reflect the key characteristics expected of a learner who has successfully completed the qualification. Every NextGen HN qualification will have a grading matrix that reflects the content and purpose of the qualification and will highlight important characteristics learners should have when they achieve a grade. The grading matrix will support a consistent and fair approach to grade judgment because it will be the same across all delivering centres for that qualification. Design Principle 4. The learner's engagement with meta skills will form part of their final grade. This nationally recognised framework is embedded in the NextGen HN qualifications, and we've incorporated it into our grading approach. However, meta skills won't be graded individually. We do not feel it's fair to try and grade, for example, a learner's integrity or creativity, but we can take learners' engagement with meta skills throughout their qualification into consideration. Therefore, this will make a small contribution to the learner's final grade. Alongside this, we have identified a requirement for a national standardisation process, which will be applied to all NextGen HN qualifications. The standardisation process will ensure that grades awarded for any particular qualification will be awarded at the same standard of learner achievement regardless of their centre. Standardisation is vital, as it will ensure the qualifications deliver on their design principles and support learners as they progress to their next stage. You can find out more information on NextGen HN at www.sqa.org.uk/NextGen, or if you have any questions, please contact nextgen@sqa.org.uk.
I hope that was a useful and interesting video. It was the right length as a introduction to the design principles that underpin those qualifications. We'll ensure that there's a link shared in the chat at the end of this meeting, and you can also find that video on the NextGen HN web pages on the SQA website. So if you do want to share some information as a kind of intro or starter about grading on these qualifications, please do feel free to direct people to that video. Now bear with me as I move on to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so I now want to go into a little bit of detail about how the grading approach works. And my aim and intention here is just to prompt some thoughts and share a little bit of understanding about the grading approach. You don't need to try and take on all of the detail that I'm going to go through, but if it does prompt any thoughts, then we welcome questions on that. And you know, this session is recorded. The information will be available in future as well if you want to go through it in more detail. So I want to focus on the grading matrix, and to do this, I'll bring up on screen an example of a grading matrix. And this is really an illustrative example. So I recognize the text is probably far too small to read in any detail, but that doesn't matter for the purposes of sharing how the grading matrix works. The grading matrix consists of three key elements or sections or different parts, and those are the three parts that I want to go through one at a time. So the first one is the criteria, and I've highlighted one here. A typical grading matrix might consist of 8, 10, or 12 different criteria. As we've said, the criteria are the key characteristics you expect of a learner who's completed the relevant qualification. You could think of them along the lines of qualification aims. And those criteria are vitally important to ensure that when you're making a judgment on a learner's achievement on a qualification, you can do it in a holistic way that really reflects the valid outcome that's expected of that qualification, rather than, for example, adding up achievement against a set of different units on a piecemeal basis. These will be the holistic and valid characteristics you're expecting of a learner at the end of the qualification. So those criteria are listed in the grading matrix, typically between 8 and 12 criteria. The next section are the descriptors. So each grading matrix, each criteria within the grading matrix will have a set of descriptors, and they will be headed as achieved, achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction. And what they're really saying is that for a particular criteria or characteristic, a learner of an achieved grade will typically look like this in the context of this particular criteria or characteristic. So they're not grades in and of themselves, but they're saying that an achieved standard learner or an achieved with merit standard learner will typically have these qualities in respect to this characteristic. And obviously that's being shown in the assessments that the learner has gone through on the qualification as a whole. And the final section of the grading matrix is the guidance section. This is a vitally important part of the grading matrix. It's the opportunity for the people who develop and write the qualification, and then in future the centres who deliver the qualification, to ensure that any useful guidance on how to interpret the criteria, how to make a judgment on that criteria, the type of assessment that you might use to make a judgment on that criteria, particular bits of content in particular units that might be particularly relevant to that criteria, all of that can go in the guidance and really flesh out and support a centre who is trying to make a judgment of a learner against a given criteria. I think it's worth saying that over time, the criteria in the grading matrix and the grading descriptors in the grading matrix, so the criteria and the descriptors, these elements of the grading matrix will stay the same over time. And that's how we'll ensure that the national standard is maintained year by year. But the guidance section of the grading matrix can be updated on a year-by-year basis. The reason for that is that we think that in the first year or two of delivery of these qualifications, centres will probably learn about how the content can be delivered, come across different types of assessment that might be particularly useful, and we'd be missing a trick if we weren't able to update the guidance to reflect that. What that means is that the guidance section is technically optional. Centres don't have to follow the guidance, but all of our experience has shown that when the guidance is well written, it makes sense to follow the guidance. But it does mean that if centres come across something new or innovative that they want to do around the delivery of the qualification, as long as it's in line with the units, in line with the criteria and descriptors, then there is room for that innovation, and it can be looked at the end of the year. And if it's relevant, then the guidance can be updated to reflect that for future years as well. So a few key considerations around the grading matrix. The grading matrix criteria themselves, they're not directly the same as content. So they're not the same as they're not a list of units, for example. They are key characteristics that reflect a learner who's achieved the qualification as a whole. And that's where we get that valid sense of a holistic grading judgment. The descriptors that sit against each of those criteria, those are not grades in and of themselves. We label them as achieved, achieved with merit, and achieved with distinction because they are reflecting that standard, but they're not in and of themselves grades. Guidance on the judging of those criteria, the descriptors, and for example, things around evidence and assessment will always be guidance, so it will always be optional. But if it's good guidance, then we think most centres will want to follow it. The final judgment on the grade is made by a best fit judgment. So centres will be able to look across all of the criteria and make a decision for any given learner what grade they believe that learner to be. So if a learner has completed the qualification, they've gone through all of the assessment and they've consistently shown a standard of, say, achieved with merit against all or almost all of the criteria, then I think it would be very reasonable to say that that learner was an achieved with merit grade overall. And that's what we mean by best fit judgment. The reason we use a best fit judgment is that in some cases you might have a learner who is a mix. It doesn't happen very often because generally speaking, a merit standard learner will be a merit across most of the content, but you don't always have the case that they're consistent. They might be a bit of a mix. And if they are a mix and don't have a consistent pattern, then a judgment still has to be made. And centres who know the content and know the assessments will be best able to make those judgments, always externally quality assured by SQA and subject to that standardisation on a year-by-year basis. I think the final consideration around the grading model is that it gives a lot of leeway to centres, and really expectation is it's sort of leveraging centre expertise in terms of how they deliver and assess their qualifications. But it does mean that centres need to ensure that the assessments that they come up with for the qualification do support grading judgments. So they support differentiation. They show where learners are stronger, in particular areas of content, and support making those judgments. And that might feel a little bit different from simply meeting the evidence requirements in any given unit, for example. So I'll move on now to a couple of final points around the grading approach. I mentioned meta skills earlier and that I would return to this, so I'll cover meta skills first. So from the start, meta skills has been part of these qualifications. It's in those design principles as a new element of content. So it's in the content, it's part of the units of the qualifications and therefore is assessed. Meta skills themselves are part of a wider general vocational framework. They're mentioned in things like the Withers Review and the Hayward Report. They are well understood in terms of what they're getting at in terms of employability skills, life skills, and so on. And there's a clear desire especially from employers, but also we've found from HEIs that learners have these meta skills if they're going to progress from these qualifications onto the next stage of their journey, whether that's into future qualifications or into employment. So they're really vital part of the qualifications. And for that reason, we thought very carefully around whether they should be part of the grading, because having graded elements of the qualifications means that they feel that much more meaningful and contribute towards that final outcome. But of course, they should only do that if it's really relevant that they contribute towards that final outcome. So where we've come to is that meta skills will be graded, but not in and of themselves. So as it said in the video I shared earlier, they won't be graded in and of themselves as competencies. Instead, what we will look to do is grade the extent and depth of learner engagement with meta skills. So the reflective activity that they might do, that is what will contribute towards their final grade. And what we've found throughout the piloting of these qualifications is that's really allowed centres to put a focus on some of those key meta skills and reliably build in delivery of those meta skills alongside the content of the qualification to the benefit of learners. Because I think we all know once we leave education, the importance of these meta skills alongside the kind of technical skills that you take into the big bad world. And to support centres doing that, we prepared a meta skills grading criteria with descriptors and guidance, which follows exactly the same pattern as the grading matrix we would have for any other criteria. Again, I share this as a illustration of what it looks like rather than to share the content. It's small text on the screen, but you'll see that it fits the exact same model as the rest of the criteria. So it's a natural fit into the process of tracking, recording, and then judging learner grades in these qualifications. So we think the benefits of having meta skills are that it will incentivize learner engagement in the meta skills. It will be a tool for centres to use when they're working with learners on meta skills. So a good way to provide feedback, for example, around their meta skills. It's aligned to the grading approach, so it fits naturally into the grading approach for these qualifications. Because it's aligned to that grading approach, it means that it can be part of standardisation discussions in future. Therefore, we can monitor a national standard that's being applied, ensure it's fair, and support it through QA. Next, I wanted to come on to learning for sustainability. I mentioned this when we looked at the design principles for the qualifications as a whole. This is another new element of the content of these qualifications. It's part of the units and it's part of the assessment. And we therefore looked very carefully to see whether learning for sustainability should be part of the grading picture of these qualifications. And our current position is that we don't think learning for sustainability should be included in the grading judgments, at least as a separate criteria in and of itself for these qualifications. The main reason for that is that we think it's much harder to consistently contextualize learning for sustainability content alongside a whole range of different types of technical content than it is for meta skills. The NextGen HNs cover a range of industry areas, everything from accounting to TV production to social sciences, you name it. And meta skills have a natural fit in all of those areas in quite a straightforward and understandable way. Learning for sustainability has slightly different opportunities for delivery depending on the qualification. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be part of the content, but the risk is that if we grade on it, some learners might end up being advantaged in a way that's not really fair if they didn't have the same opportunities on another qualification. So for that reason, we've held off including grading and of learning for sustainability in these qualifications. But it's very much still part of the content. It will show up in the assessment, it must be assessed, and it's clearly an extremely important subject area for these qualifications going forward in the future. Okay, for the final part of this session, I just want to cover some information around standardization. I've mentioned this a couple of times already. What we mean by standardization in this sense is standardization of whole qualification grade judgments against an agreed national standard across centres and over time. We think that's really important because where we're moving away from quite familiar graded units that tend to be grading across a smaller range of content and in perhaps a slightly easier to quality assure way, we're now asking centres to make much broader judgments across a whole range of content. And there are many, many benefits that come from that, but they will only be realised if the grade judgments are fair and reliable across all of centres and year on year. So we need some way to support centres to do that well and prove that we're controlling that and that those judgments are valid and reliable. So there will be a formal process in place for all NextGen HNs. That process is currently being defined and it will be delivered this session for a couple of the qualifications that have formally rolled out of pilot. And that will be an opportunity to test and evaluate that process and ensure that it's fit for purpose in the same way that we piloted and evaluated the grading approach and other elements of the design principles for these qualifications. Because it's a process that will be piloted and evaluated, it may change over time. So what I'm going to share now is the process as we currently see it at quite a high level. And I do this just to share kind of information and see if there are any comments or questions in the chat for this meeting, because it's useful as part of the evaluation. But I do want to make it clear that I'm sharing this as something which will be evaluated over the next year. So it may not necessarily be the final version. So the standardization process will be applied per qualification. We standardize on a qualification basis. So every single qualification needs to be standardized. There are about 20 odd, 22, 23 current NextGen qualifications, and there will probably, well, there are more that are coming along the pipeline, so there'll be more in future. And it relies partly on the fact that every qualification will already have traditional EQA, or what might in the past have been called external verification of unit achievement. So really what we're standardizing is just the final grade judgment. If a learner has achieved all of the units for a particular qualification, then they are an achieved by definition. So what we're looking at is the judgment that they're an achieved with merit or achieved with distinction. Beyond that, is that a correct judgment? So each year, centres will deliver the qualification. They'll form a view on what they judge the final grade to be for each of their learners. In the piloting and evaluation, the way this has worked is centres have gone through assessments. They've tracked the standard they thought the learner was at. In some cases, they've given nominal grades to pieces of assessment. You know, this piece of assessment might be of a merit grade, for example. They've tracked and recorded that. And then at the end of the year, they have a very good idea of what a learner's grade will be. They then check that internally against the grading criteria to make sure they're making the right judgment, and then reach a conclusion on that final grade. Once they've done that, a standardization event would be held, and that would be held on a yearly basis. Now, this event could be anything from a desk-based review all the way up to a face-to-face meeting with a group of centres. I've put an asterisk against this one because I'll return to this. We don't know exactly what this will look like, and there has to be a balance in terms of things like centres' time, SQA's time, resources, and so on, against the importance of the standardisation approach. That event will take place after those initial grade judgments are reached, but before results are published. We have to do standardization to confirm the results are good before we publish them. And that means it will likely take place in a fairly limited period of time in roughly May or June. So it will require careful planning. Carrying on, don't worry, there's only 2 slides of this process. At that event, the approach to the grade judgment would be discussed. So discussion would be chaired by SQA, normally EQAs at SQA, but the discussion will really take place between the centres, because in this case, the centres are the judges. They're the ones who've done the assessment, done the marking for these qualifications. So they're comparing how they've done that, discussing whether they agree on the national standard with the SQA, EQA chairing that discussion. Discussion would be based on examples of learner work that's been provisionally graded. Anyone who's been a marker and gone to a marker standardization meeting will be familiar with the concept. So you'd look at some examples of learner work at particular grades, check that you agree with the judgment, and have a discussion around any areas where you might not initially agree. Agreement would be reached on judgments. Any changes to grades would be applied by centres before the final results are then submitted. If agreement can't be reached in some circumstances, then the chair would hold the final say. So the SQA, EQA would hold the final say. And then the guidance in the grading matrix, as we looked at earlier in the session, would be updated to reflect that discussion. So anything that comes out of that discussion, anything that hadn't been thought of before, anything useful for future years can be added into that guidance to support following year's delivery. So coming back to that caveat, I said that we have to be careful about the nature of those standardization events, and the number and nature of those standardization events might vary. It's not the case that we would have a face-to-face meeting for every single qualification every year for the life of a qualification. It will have to be based on a balance between the resources, the time available from centres and SQA, and also the need to ensure all grade judgments are fair and consistent with a national standard. So in an example where you have a brand new qualification rolling out to new centres, you probably would want to have more of a kind of face-to-face type meeting where you've got the opportunity to discuss those judgments. In an example where you've got a qualification that's been running with the same group of centres for a year or two, EQAs are happy with delivery, standardization has gone smoothly before, that might be more of a light touch approach to standardization. So you still have an event, but it might be more of a light touch event. That's what we're defining as we work through the delivery of the first qualifications coming out of pilot this year. And we don't know exactly what that will look like going forward, but it's very much going to be set in the balance of resources, time available from centres, and the need to ensure those grade judgments are fair and consistent. If we can get that process right, then the benefits it brings are really important. So it will allow SQA, or in future Qualifications Scotland, to ensure that grades are judged consistently, that they're judged in the same way across different centres, that they are judged in the same way year by year on the delivery of the qualification. It will give a really robust response to any external challenge or scrutiny around the standard of the new grades and the new grading approach. And that's particularly important, not just for SQA to justify how it's come up with this grading approach, but it's important for learners on the qualification who are going to go on to the next step in their journey. So that means really HEIs and employers, they'll need to have real confidence in these grade judgments, know that they are standardized, fair and reliable. It will address centres' concerns which have been expressed during our piloting and evaluation. A common theme from centres was, how do we know we're judging to the right standard? It's a good faith question. Centres are asking, I don't want to be too strict on my learners. I don't want to be too lenient on my learners. We need to judge to the right standard. So it will address centres' concerns and support delivery. It will also be an opportunity to generate exemplar materials, support materials, update guidance, and essentially become a kind of positive feedback loop amongst a community of deliverers for these qualifications, so that they can be delivered in a fair and reliable way going forward. One way we might do that is through our understanding standards approach. I think this will be a key part of the standardization process. Traditionally, SQA's understanding standards events have focused on NQ type quals, so NAT5s, hires. But we think we can adapt similar methods to the NextGen HN qualifications to support how standardization works and really shore up good quality delivery. So we'll be looking for support to source those exemplars and ensure we have representative evidence. And in some cases, we might ask centres to be involved in some of that, all to be planned out, but we think that will be part of the picture. Finally, only the first qualifications that have come out of pilot this session, which are the NextGen HNC and HND television qualifications, just those two, have come out of pilot in this session. So for 24-25, only those qualifications will have standardization applied. Other qualifications remain in pilot and they have the very thorough piloting quality assurance approach. So we're confident in those. But standardization will be applied to any qualification in future that comes out of pilot. Other qualifications are remaining in pilot for that session, but they're expected to be rolled out for session 25, 26 and beyond, and they'll have standardization applied at that stage. Okay, so that concludes my session.